Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Welcome to day 10 of Teaser Season for patch 3.29 and the upcoming Curse of the Allflame expansion. Today, Granny Gear Games looked like they were going to put out nothing for us, and then right near the end of the New Zealand Business Day, they decided to drop some pretty big news. All the information on what's happening with the Scion's Reliquarian Ascendancy. Now, this was a bit of a miss in 3.28, but this one is going to be very different in 3.29. There's a number of really cool things that this Ascendancy can now do, including giving you access to Pinnacle Boss and even Uber Pinnacle Boss drops very early in your character's progression. But kind of indirectly, because they're coming as an Ascendancy notable rather than as something that is part of your normal character's build. It's been really interesting brainstorming some ideas with people on this for all sorts of things, from a complete meme that would be using Zoph's Inception and Burning Arrow of Vigor, and using that in conjunction with the Apostate, which is something that is normally an Uber Cortex drop, but that you can get quite early on your character in this league, all the way through to some things that look like they could be much more powerful around empowering spells and adding flat physical damage to spells, in much the same way that some of the minion pack builds that tore things up in 3.28 did. So let's break into it. For those of you that don't remember, the Reliquarian is the new Ascendancy the Scion picked up. Now, the core structure of the Ascendancy is quite different to what you're used to on all of the other Ascendancies in the game for classes that are not the Scion. This is, however, the same as the Scion's Ascendant. You don't really get anything from your first Labyrinth. You get a major point from your second Labyrinth, but it's actually your third point, not your fourth one. And you get a major point for your sixth point for your third Labyrinth. Then after that, the Eternal Labyrinth gives you the last 2 points. Now, going through what you can get here, it's worth noting that everything here is a very wide selector. So what we're going to do is look at your options that you've got for your third point. Remember, your first 2 points are pretty bad. You're getting these from the Cruel Labyrinth rather than getting them from the first Labyrinth. And there are 5 options here, and they vary quite a bit in power and also quite a bit in when they're strong. So let's start with the ones that are stronger early, but that don't necessarily do quite as much late in the game. Firstly, we have Vaal Caress. You gain Onslaught for 20 seconds, which is a very long time upon using a Vaal skill. Onslaught is 20% movement speed, attack speed, and cast speed, so it is a lot, but there are other sources of Onslaught available in the game. What this should mean in practice is that you almost always have Onslaught up once you're in maps, and that you very frequently have it up earlier than that. But you also gain +2 to the level of all Vaal skill gems. Now, other effects in the game that cause you to gain +2 to the level of Vaal skill gems don't just give it to the Vaal version of the gem. So it's not like you're running around with a level 9 Fireball that also has level 11 Vaal Fireball attached to it. No, in that situation, if the gem says it's level 9, then you'll get the benefit of level 11 damage to both Fireball and Vaal Fireball. And assuming that Vaal Caress here works the same way, that's actually fairly strong on a number of different gems. Probably not enough to make Fireball good, but for things that are already fairly good Vaal gems, this is something that's solid on Vaal spell skills only. So Vaal Caress, this is an option to consider. It gives you quite a bit of damage. It gives you cast speed, it gives you attack speed and movement speed, but all of those latter stats are conditional. The +2 to the level of all Vaal skill gems, though, that's just a big deal. So that's quite strong. And yeah, when I was editing this, I realized also Vaal Smite isn't technically a spell, but it does gain a moderate amount from this as well, especially at lower gem levels. Vaal Smite doesn't scale as aggressively as spells do, but it does scale pretty well, and it's the aura part that gains the most out of it. The thing with Vaal Smite, though, is that you're going to be gaining a lot out of the attack speed bonus that you get from Onslaught as well. So yeah, definitely I like Vaal Caress for Vaal Smite too. After this, we have Elevore. Now, Elevore is a helmet that has pretty much those same mechanics, and you're going to get 25% suppression chance, 25% elemental ailment avoidance, and recover 200 life when you suppress spell damage. Now, this, in conjunction with the item with the same name, is going to pretty much make you invincible when it comes to spell damage throughout the entire campaign, and probably even through white maps. So it's pretty strong early on. As for in the very late game, I'm much less sold on it. This is 1/3 of your entire Ascendancy, and whilst the 25% are really nice, recovering 200 life when you suppress spell damage, there are more explosive forms of burst recovery available at endgame. So I don't mind this, but I wouldn't want to take this, especially given how good some of the other options are. After this, we have Kaom's Roots. Do not take this on an evasion character, please. Please do not take this on an evasion character. It has the text, cannot evade enemy attacks. This is equivalent to setting your character's evasion rating to 0, overriding whatever you've got. So you don't want that. But you cannot be stunned. Action speed cannot be modified to below your base value. You cannot be knocked back. And you get 100 maximum life. This is a reasonably solid defensive setup as long as you're not reliant upon evasion. And I would only consider taking this really in conjunction with either Iron Reflexes or just using absolutely no pieces of gear that are evasion based. You're getting a fair bit for this, but where there are two other classes that can gain something reasonably similar to this, both the Trickster and the Juggernaut can get things that prevent their action speed being nerfed too hard. The problem with the Scion version is that here it is 1/3 of your Ascendancy rather than 1/4. For that reason, even though Kaom's Root does slightly more than the comparable node on the Juggernaut or the comparable node on the Trickster, I actually prefer those other two nodes. Not a bad node, but I think there are two others that are much more exciting. So let's start with the first of the really exciting ones, and that is Dawnbreaker. This is a Pinnacle boss drop. It's the common drop, I think, from the Searing Exarch, the regular version. And 25% of cold, lightning, and physical damage is taken as fire damage. Now, this is one of those things that sometimes is not doing anything useful for you. But if you have it, you're going to build around it. The idea here is that you can set up a character that has no investment into cold resistance or lightning resistance at all, or potentially very minimal resistance into them. And so definitely nothing beyond 75%. But then can have a tremendous amount of investment into fire resistance, potentially have 90% fire resistance. And on top of that, because you're converting 25% of physical damage taken into fire damage, that can be incredibly good in conjunction with more of the same effect, which you will find on very conveniently on Cloak of Flame. If you have Cloak of Flame equipped as an item and Dawnbreaker as an Ascendancy option, then suddenly 65% of all physical damage your character suffers is instead hitting your fire resistance rather than trying to hit your armor and any physical damage reduction that you might happen to have. That can be extremely, extremely strong when it comes to deadly big hits. But the other really strong part of Dawnbreaker is that most of the tougher bosses in the game have some way to penetrate resistances that players have got, but they only penetrate the damage types that they're actually doing themselves. So if a boss is doing a really huge lightning attack, it might have 15% lightning penetration on it. But that doesn't help the boss deal damage when you're suffering that damage as fire damage, because it only penetrates your lightning resistance, not your fire resistance. And that's something that means that Dawnbreaker can be incredibly strong on bosses like Uber Shaper in particular. If I recall correctly, Uber Shaper has more than 25% cold penetration on some of his skills, and that's something that can rip you apart. But when you're taking some of this cold damage as fire damage instead, and especially if you're then stacking more of this effect, such as by a Timeless Jewel that makes 50% of cold and lightning damage be taken as fire damage, or potentially a Sublime Vision, which can make 40% be taken as fire damage of cold and lightning again, and there's lots of things you can combine together. What you're looking for here, the Holy Grail, and there are several ways to achieve this, is to have 100% of physical damage taken as fire, 100% of cold damage taken as fire, 100% of lightning damage taken as fire. If you can get this, then you can treat cold resistance and lightning resistance completely as dump stats. You can just ignore them entirely, and you can build up 90% fire resistance, and you can also treat all forms of physical mitigation as dump stats as well. So that's Dawnbreaker, lots of options there. This is not something that's going to necessarily set the world on fire when you get it, but this is definitely the most powerful for general use late in progression. And finally, we have the Apostate. So the Apostate is an item that drops from the Uber Cortex. Now, the version that you get here in the Ascendancy is worse than the item that exists in the real game. However, that is done very deliberately because the Apostate has a hidden modifier on it. Here are the stats on the item. You'll notice that it has no attribute requirements or energy shield, and this is a hidden mod, and it's got a whole bunch of strength and resistances on it. But the key thing it's got is that you gain maximum life instead of maximum energy shield from equipped armor items. But this is in the chest slot. The chest slot is the slot that provides the most energy shield of any slot in the game. And as a result, just by equipping the Apostate, you're massively, massively behind on the amount of energy shield that you can get. Well, The way that that's been balanced for here is that you gain minus 12 maximum life per level. Now that's going to end up as minus 1200. The thing is that at endgame, you can actually get 1200 energy shield on a chest piece. So you can end up coming out ahead of actually equipping the Apostate, and you also get all of the other benefits that are found on whatever chest piece you're using. Chances are those are better than 30 to 50 to strength and 20 to 30 to all elemental resistances. If you are actually using the Apostate, you probably have pretty good rolls there. So let's assume that you've got, say, 48 to strength and 30% tri-res. I think you can do better than that with just the suffixes that are on your chest. But on top of that, you're not limited to just suffixes. You can also have Eldritch Implicits. Or potentially instead of Eldritch Implicits, you might have Synthesis Implicits. Or potentially instead of both, you might have classic influence modifiers. So there are lots and lots of things that you can put together there on the Apostate. And it's a really interesting thing to build around. Now, one thing I really like about this period at the start of a league when things are being revealed is that there's a number of things that you can see will have some impact, some synergy with something already in game that's never been good. And Burning Arrow of Vigor came to mind here. The reason that I call this out is because the Apostate in general is extremely good at allowing you to stack life on a character. Especially in conjunction with Dissolution of the Flesh, this can allow you to really, really, really build up a massive maximum life pool, which you could then use with some meme skill like Burning Arrow of Vigor. This has never been good. But with this setup, you can get this going, and you could potentially get a tremendous amount, upwards of 4,000 flat fire damage, that's added just by your gem. So deals added fire damage equal to 32% of maximum life. That can easily become more than 4,000 if you've got something like 12,000 life. And at that point, you can do some pretty silly things with it because you can use a bow that is otherwise terrible. A bow like Zoph's Nurture, or a bow like the other version of Zoph's Nurture, Zoph's Inception. And Zoph's Inception has a reasonably interesting double Foulborn variant. So there's a whole lot of things you could potentially do here to get a bunch of extra damage out of weapons that have terrible, terrible baseline damage. And it's all around life stacking and using Burning Arrow of Vigor, using the Apostate, but without being forced to use the Apostate as an item, being able to use a rare item instead. Is this good? Probably not. It's going to take a bunch of theory crafting to work it out. But at the very least, it's interesting. It's something cool to play around with and maybe get to work. And otherwise, even if we never get it there, at least it's a fun thought to have. So that is the third point that you get. Let's have a look at your options for the sixth point. Now, these are grouped together in two clumps. You have one clump up the top, which is weapons that are oriented around spellcasters, and one down the bottom that are weapons that are oriented around attack builds. Note that you are not required to use them in this way. Having a look here at the options that are more spellcaster themed. One that I think is very interesting is Sands of Time. This is one of two items that are tied to Saresh of the Weeping Black, and it's probably the less exciting of the two, but it is still definitely kind of cool that it's here. So not suggesting this is necessarily all that great, but Sands of Time is an option. More interesting is just the fact that Saresh's loot is available here, and some people are interpreting this to mean that Saresh is definitely still available in the game somehow, just not through the Black Barrier. Other people are interpreting this to mean that no, you can't get Saresh's loot, but just that legacy items are in the pool of things that the Reliquarian could conceivably have. We don't know which of these interpretations is true, but definitely feel free to be hyped about the thought of Saresh possibly coming back, especially when we get to one of these later ones at the end. Firstly, we have Arakaali's Fang. Trigger level 20 raised spiders on kill. This thing is incredibly good early in progression. Now, when I say early in progression, you can't get this until the third labyrinth. So it's not like you're going to have it from really early on or anything. But if you're wanting to get through the Atlas quickly, this might be one of the best ways. It gets outscaled at endgame though. The level 20 raised spiders is basically about the same as an Arakaali's Fang with 2 support gems in it. However, you can use it in conjunction with a weapon that is not Arakaali's Fang, and that can potentially be better overall. So that's Arakaali's Fang as an option. Really, really good early in the game because Arakaali's Fang is a crazy rare item. You probably won't get it yourself until quite a while later. Probably won't even see it until you're level 95 for that matter. It is really rare. But at the same time, it is something that does fall behind using Arakaali's Fang itself in conjunction with a Squire much later in progression. Very, very strong while clearing the Atlas. Definitely good enough to take down pinnacle bosses. Might be something that struggles with the juiciest content in the game. Xirgil's Crank is next. +1 gem level is really strong. That's like 15% more spell damage in general. 30% chance for energy shield recharge to start when you block. That's all cool and all. Overall, though, I don't think this is worth 1/3 of your entire Ascendancy. It does something real, and if it was 2 points on a normal Ascendancy, I'd be like, yep, I'll probably take that, but they'll be the worst 2 points that you take. And rounding out the less exciting ones, we also have Femurs of the Saints. Femurs of the Saints has a 1% chance to block attack damage per summoned skeleton, 2% increased attack and cast speed per summoned Raging Spirit. That one's actually pretty substantial. Regen 0.6% of life per second for each raised zombie, and 30% increased mana regeneration rate per raised Spectre. This can provide you with a lot of benefits if you are running around with an entire zoo, and you will lose all of those benefits straight away if certain slams or damage over time effects end up wiping out all of your minions. That's the problem with this. Definitely does something useful, but I don't think it does quite enough for me to be excited about it. All that said, let's get on to the exciting two. Firstly, Shimmeron. Shimmeron is an item that has really fallen out of favor just by virtue of kind of being outclassed, outpower crept. However, you can definitely get a bunch of power charges at endgame. And here, you're looking at 8% to crit multi per power charge, 0.3% to base critical strike chance per power charge, and a very welcome 3% chance to block spell damage per power charge. So if we compare this to the amount of block that you get for Femurs of the Saints, yeah, sure, you can drop Vaal Summon Skeletons and get, for a period of time, like 18-20% chance to block attack damage here. But with Shimmeron, you're going to be pretty constantly at a pretty high amount of spell block here. This is like getting Tempest Shield for free, on top of everything else that you're getting here in the way of crits. So I really like what I'm seeing with Shimmeron here. I think there's a lot of potential. Above that, the Black Cane. Each summoned phantasm gives you phantasmal might. This on its own is solid. This is one of those items that does way more than people ever give it credit for. It adds a lot of flat physical damage onto your spells. That's what Phantasmal Might does. However, you can scale up the amount of summoned phantasms that you've got in conjunction with one of the helmets that drops from the incarnations. It allows you to double the number of phantasms that you've got summoned, and that can be truly, truly explosive. That is going to be where the Black Cane is going to end up being worthwhile and potentially provide you with a very large amount of flat physical damage. Alternately, instead of having the helmet that provides you with double the amount of phantasms, you can instead get a similar effect by having a Forbidden Shako that provides very, very high level summoned phantasms. Now, high level summoned phantasms will then provide you better versions of Phantasmal Might. So the Black Cane effect, really, really strong here. This is one of the better things that's available on the top end of the tree. The thing that makes everything really come together, though, is potentially using Soulwrest. Soulwrest is something that is normally mutually exclusive with Death's Hand. You can use one, you can use the other, you can't use both at once. But in the context of this new Scion Ascendancy, you can get access to both of them at the same time. And you could use this in conjunction with the Dark Monarch to then potentially get as many as 44 summoned phantasms. If you want full details on exactly how this will work, then you should read the full write-up of how Soulwrest and how Summoned Phantasm works on the POE wiki, linked down in the description below. This is then going to provide you with an absolutely tremendous amount of flat damage that is added to every spell that you cast. This flat damage will be physical, and it will make you into an absolute wrecking ball. If we look down at the bottom, we're going to have some things that are attack weapon themed, and these vary a lot in quality as well. But actually, they're kind of pretty good, most of them. Let's start with the biggest disappointment of all, which is Fidelitus' Spike. Hits Always Shock is nice. Deal no physical damage is certainly very manageable. Herald of Thunder has 100% increased buff effect and 100% increased mana reservation efficiency. None of this is bad, but none of it is enough. I cannot see this being justified as essentially 3 points of your Ascendancy. I don't think you're getting enough power here, and as a result, I'm not going to recommend taking that on pretty much anything. I want to address the Shattered Divinity next. So firstly, 40 strength, 40 dexterity, that's really nice. You've got to get those boring stats somewhere. But the main purpose here is summon Greater Harbinger of Direction skill. Now, this is an interesting one. This is something where I cannot find authoritative information about exactly how this works online at all. Now, the Path of Exile wiki doesn't have full information on it. POEDB doesn't have full information on it. The way that I understand it to work, though, is that it conjures a minion. I know this part is true. That minion will follow you around, and once every 8 seconds, it will cast a spell on you. That spell will provide a buff that has a 4-second base duration, and that buff will provide +2 projectiles, +2 pierce, +2 chain, and +2 forks. So when I say +2 forks, I mean forks and forks again. However, with the way that projectiles work, the pierces have to be used up first before you get any benefit from the rest. And that's important to keep in mind. So basically, if you're firing into a big pack, this is going to be absolutely incredible. But if you're firing at 2 monsters, you'll have to line them up to hit both of them because you're not going to be piercing through all of your pierces. And as a result, you're not going to end up getting the sorts of projectile good stuff that's going on. The key thing, though, is that by default, this only has 50% uptime. And you really want to get this to 100% somehow. I'm not sure if you can get this to 100% because I've not played around with these Harbinger skills. If you can, I can definitely see a purpose to this. So you're getting 40 strength, 40 dexterity, you're getting 2 pierces, and you're getting the ability that once all of your pierces are used up, projectile utter hell is unleashed. And this is alongside +2 projectiles. So while you've got the uptime on this, the effect is really, really, really strong. The key thing is going to be exactly some of those specific niche interactions, working out exactly how they work. So not sure if this is good or not. It could be extremely good. And if it is as good as I hope it is, then it's something that could be used in conjunction with lots of other things. Anything that can function well with a bow is going to get a lot out of this. However, pretty much everything else here has some cool things going for it. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but Eldir, or Eldir, or whatever it is, the one that is related to Warcries. This is a claw that gets outscaled really quickly at endgame. People don't use it as an endgame weapon, but it's always had potential. Enemies that are taunted by your Warcries explode on death. They deal 8% of their maximum life as chaos damage. Note that this is all of the enemies that are in your area, but also note that it is something that can be used in conjunction with slams. It can be used in conjunction with all sorts of different things. You're not stuck with attacks that are claw-based. And that, I think, is the reason that this has some interesting potential. Also, Warcry's skills cooldown time is far better with this. It's overwritten to 4 seconds, which is something that's substantially better than the default. Definitely keep this one in mind. Note that because it is 4 seconds, you might not necessarily have it up for every single pack that you fight, and that ends up being a limiting factor on it. After this, we have the Sacred Chalice. Now, this one is strong, but this one also asks a lot of you. If you are regularly using Sapphire, Ruby, and Topaz flasks, then you're going to be gaining a lot here. Firstly, you're gaining a flask charge when you deal a critical strike, and also you're gaining 20% of physical damage added as extra cold, fire, and lightning. I don't think you're going to have 100% uptime on this. I think you can get a fairly good uptime on it. It won't be 100%, but that can still be really, really good at giving you a chunk of extra damage when you really need it. I will also mention that this is something that falls off completely if and when you get Mage Blood, because you do not use your Sapphire flasks, Ruby flasks, or Topaz flasks. They are applied to you, but they cannot be used with Mage Blood. So that's not going to work there. That's a complete and utter non-bo. Still, the Sacred Chalice, you're getting a lot of payoff here. It's doing something interesting. Arn's Might is really interesting. Arn's Might has 20% more accuracy rating when you're at maximum frenzy charges, but it actually penalizes your maximum number of frenzy charges by 1. Normally that would be terrible, but then if you look further, you can see 100% to crit multi while you have no frenzy charges. Now this one actually competes in a lot of ways with Shimmeron before. Both Arn's Might and Shimmeron provide you a big chunk of critical strike multiplier with charge-related conditions on them. For Shimmeron, it's being at maximum power charges and having as many of them as you can. For Arn's Might, it's being at minimum frenzy charges. However, there are plenty of ways to make these conditions work out. And ultimately, I think Arn's Might is very doable. As for the maximum frenzy charges, you do have the opportunity to socket jewels that give you -1 maximum frenzy charge, but broadly speaking, those jewels are pretty terrible even in a build like this, because all you're getting for spending 2 jewel slots is going to be 20% more accuracy rating, assuming that you're always at 0 frenzy charges, which you probably are. You might be able to find other ways of decreasing your maximum number of frenzy charges, but it is generally pretty difficult to do that. So I would assess this as being plus 100% crit multi, and you cannot use frenzy charges. That's the way that I would assess Arn's Might, as being decide whether you like that in your build, and then you can assess whether or not you want to play around with some of the other things that are involved here as well. Finally, we have Namahu's Flame. Namahu's Flame has been exciting some people. We need to talk about the mechanics of this. Now, Namahu's Flame is a single unique weapon that used to be considered fairly good. However, it has really been outscaled over recent times. It has 20% chance to trigger level 16 Molten Burst on melee hit, and it has bad baseline damage. The problem with this is that the actual Molten Burst ability is something that scales tremendously with the weapon that you're attacking with, because it does damage based upon what that weapon is, 170% of base damage. So the fact that Namahu's Flame is terrible as a weapon means that the item isn't really used, and neither is the skill. Well, when it comes to the Reliquarian can bypass this. They can use this in conjunction with a good weapon. But, there's a couple of things you need to know here. Firstly, part of the damage from Molten Burst comes from the fact that any gems that are socketed in Namahu's Flame, whether or not they are linked to the attack skill that triggered the Molten Burst, those support gems empower the Molten Burst. So you're going to miss out on 6 support gems. The second thing, though, is that there is a cooldown. Now, this is 150 milliseconds in game, but in practice, there's actually 165 milliseconds because of the way that server ticks work. So there is an effective cooldown of 165 milliseconds on this. You can potentially invest a bit in cooldown reduction, and you can get this under 132 milliseconds, and then it becomes 132 milliseconds because that will be 4 server ticks. But doing that is going to take a fair bit of investment. So you need to keep in mind that you're only going to be triggering Molten Burst once per 165 milliseconds normally, or 132 milliseconds if you go out of your way to invest in some sort of cooldown mitigation. So that's the limitations there. But at the same time, damage penetrating 20% of fire resistance is pretty chunky. And ultimately, I think Namahu's Flame has some potential here. This is a reasonably strong effect. It's not going to be quite as good as the Molten Strikes that you get out of your Namahu's Flame actual item, but at the same time, your base damage is going to be better, and you're penetrating 20% fire resistance. You can do big chunks of damage with this effect. So this one is one of the stronger nodes here, but overall, I think your 5th and 6th nodes, I think that you've got some better choices up in the north area in general. The Black Cane and Shimmeron seem to be the strongest, but they don't fit every build. And for the builds that they don't fit, I think maybe consider the Sacred Chalice, maybe consider Arn's Might, maybe consider Aldir, and maybe consider Namahu's Flame. All of them do something. Finally, we come to the last points. Now, we have something really interesting here. Now, this is one of those things where the actual effect of the points is not very exciting, but the presence of them on the tree is. And that is Screams of the Desiccated. So we know Screams of the Desiccated, the way that you used to get it during Mirage League, is not going to exist in Curse of the Allflame. So people had been expecting it's just gone kaput legacy completely. But Granny Gear Games went out of their way to make it available indirectly through the Reliquarian. As we said earlier, one interpretation is this just being the Reliquarian is a collector of things from Raid class history, so maybe they can get things that aren't accessible anymore. But then at the same time, the second interpretation is, well, there's a new drop location for Screams of the Desiccated. We don't know which of these is true yet, but it's a little bit of a hint. Maybe it'll be back, maybe it won't, but keep that one in mind. As for the actual Screams of the Desiccated itself, though, yeah, just no. You have Impenetrable Shrine buff while affected by no flasks. This is strong except for that condition of no flasks, but flasks are so much of your power, and they actually overlap so much with what you get from Impenetrable Shrine. Now, this is a bit less the case for Energy Shield builds. Energy Shield builds maybe could consider this, but while affected by no flasks is a pretty extreme condition. And the reason that the Shrine Belt was so good in Mirage League was because there were more powerful versions of it than Impenetrable by itself, and also because there was another way that you could benefit from turning off your flasks, and that was the Third Ring Ascendancy. However, the Third Ring Bloodline is not something you can take in conjunction with an 8-pointer on a single Ascendancy. So, Screams of the Desiccated, it's not so good that it's worth going out of your way to equip the Gull and all of the rest of the package, and it's not good enough on its own to justify using without flasks. Let's just pretend it doesn't exist, except for the exciting things that it tells you about the fact that Screams of the Desiccated is certainly something grinding gear games are still thinking about. Presence of Chayula is next. 20% of maximum life converted to energy shield is a powerful effect. It's not worth equipping Presence of Chayula for in the normal game, but it is definitely something that's strong. Can't be stunned is also great. This is a lot of power here for certain builds. Most builds won't want it, but it is something that does something inherently strong, and you should keep it on your radar, but most of the time, you're probably going to want to pick one of the others. And lastly, Polaric Devastation, while we're looking through the ones that are perhaps a bit less exciting. 40% increased duration of ailments on enemies. This is great, but it's also not incredibly good. And then you've got cover enemies in Ash or Frost for 5 seconds when you ignite or freeze them respectively. Both of these are solid effects. There is nothing wrong with this as an option. It's something you could definitely take. I just think the other options are a bit more exciting. So let's start with Kaom's Binding. Nearby enemies convert 25% of their physical damage to fire. Please note that this modifies the damage the enemy is dealing. This is not the same as the stat that exists on Cloak of Flame. It's not the same as the stat that exists on the Dawnbreaker notable that is found on this Ascendancy. It is strong, but they don't stack very favorably with each other. You can definitely take both Kaom's Binding and also Dawnbreaker, but they won't stack as well as you want. This will take 25% of the physical damage that is left and will convert that, rather than being 25% that stacks additively with them. But 15% increased strength is also a lot, and this is a genuine defensive layer on builds that aren't investing in the other type of stats, so the Cloak of Flame / Dawnbreaker effect. This is pretty strong, and there will be builds that can definitely put this to good use. Definitely not for every build, but for a minority of builds, this is going to be really good. Melding of the Flesh is next. Melding of the Flesh is an item that has the same upside as this effect. So elemental resistances are capped by your highest maximum elemental resistance instead. What this means is that if your cold resistance is 85% of 75%, so it's 75% is the cap, and you're overcapped at 85%, and your fire resistance is at 175% of 90%, then your cold resistance is going to be capped by that 90%. So instead of being 85%, but the last 10 points are wasted, it'll be 85% undercapped, and you would be able to actually benefit from up to 5 more points of it. Melding comes with a drawback, -5 to all maximum elemental resistances. This is very manageable, but it is also something you need to keep in mind. The actual Melding Jewel has additional text. It has an additional drawback that gives you something like -200 total points of resistance. Now, a lot of players on the Path of Exile subreddit have been understating how bad a penalty this is. Getting -200 total to elemental resistances, so that's like -70 or so to each of 3 of them. This is really bad because you've got to make it up somewhere. And all the ways that you could make it up come at an opportunity cost. It's never free to get these resistances. They mean that you don't have space for some other mod that might be better there. Instead of getting suppression, you've got to build up all these resistances. Instead of getting attributes, you've got to build up these resistances, and then perhaps you solve your attributes in a different way. Instead, you solve your attributes via using the Timeless Jewel, and in doing so, you lose out on maybe 100 base life. Every way that you're going to fix up the resistance penalty that's found on real melding is going to come at a very genuine cost. The other way that people commonly do it is by dedicating an entire Mage Blood flask to it. So your Mage Blood ends up worse than it would be if you didn't have to do that. All of that said, Melding the Flesh, this effect is strong. It's universally good, at least as long as you're able to make your maximum elemental resistances really high for one of them. Aegis Aurora in particular is great here because Aegis Aurora is a strong defensive item anyway, but at the same time, it also gives you 5 to maximum cold resistance. So there's a lot of potential here. But you will find that once you've got Mage Blood, the opportunity cost of getting those resistances does go down because it just becomes one Mage Blood flask. And at that point, maybe you want to go with something else. Finally, we have one of my little favorites here that I feel hasn't been getting enough interest online. Gloomfang. Skills chain +1 times. This is already strong. This is not quite worth an Ascendancy notable on its own, but is very close to it. And it's something that is a strong pull into the Deadeye for a lot of projectile builds. I also want to point out that this is an unconditional chain, whereas the Harbinger of Directions option that you've got on one of the other Ascendancy notables, that is conditional on the projectile having already pierced twice, and it is conditional upon the timing working out as well. The Gloomfang is just unconditional +1 chain. A chain is much stronger when it's reliable. Then at the same time, projectiles that have chained gain 20% of non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage. Now, you may or may not be able to scale this effectively on your character, but if you can, this is really, really strong. This allows you to do quite a lot more damage and to project it really well. This is something that actually comes back to the things we were talking about before about the Apostate and Zoph's Nurture or Zoph's Inception or various other options. This is one of the other things that was leaning me towards considering that as a potential setup there. Lots of little pieces that come together, everything on the Ascendancy works in order to make a bow build that normally wouldn't be possible potentially come together. And that's what I think I really like the most about the Reliquarian here. It's not necessarily that it's obviously going to be the best at any specific thing, although I would say that it's quite plausible that the Black Cane could be one of the best builds of the league. But it is something that does really cool stuff in a lot of different ways and empowers playstyles that might not exist next league. I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.